Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into one of the most intense and exhausting chapters in modern human history. A world where the air feels heavy with smoke and damp earth. The ground never stays stable beneath your boots, and something distant but constant is always shaking the horizon. We're diving into what life was really like during World War I. Forget the idea of war as something clean, heroic, or far away. The reality was far more brutal and far more draining. This wasn't just fighting on a battlefield. It was surviving a full-time environment designed to wear people down in every possible way. And honestly, you probably wouldn't last 24 hours here without realizing just how overwhelming it really was. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you actually enjoy this content. And drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft ambient background hum, and let's step into a very different kind of morning. Imagine cold, wet air sitting low over a shattered landscape, endless stretches of mud and broken ground fading into the distance, and a silence that never truly lasts because it's always interrupted by something far away. Congratulations, you've just arrived on the Western Front during World War I. The good news? You're still alive. The bad news? You're about to find out how quickly that can change. Within the first 24 hours, everything you think you understand about survival starts to break down. It's not just the fighting, it's everything around it. The mud that drags at every step, the constant damp that never leaves your clothes, the exhaustion that builds even when you're not moving. Sleep doesn't feel like rest, food doesn't feel like recovery, and silence never really feels safe. You quickly realize this isn't a place where you settle in. It's a place where you adapt minute by minute, because the environment itself is constantly working against you. The sounds in the distance never fully stop, the ground never feels stable, and even standing still feels like effort. And that's before you even see what's ahead. Because World War I isn't just something happening in the distance, it's something you're inside of. And once you're inside it, the idea of making it through even a single day starts to feel a lot less certain than you expected. In the early years of the 20th century, Europe feels calm. Not silent, but steady, settled into rhythms that seem permanent. It is a calm shaped by routine and reinforced by familiarity, where each day unfolds in predictable patterns. If you were to walk through a city in the summer of 1913, nothing would suggest that the world stands on the edge of something irreversible. The streets are alive, but not hurried. Horse-drawn carts move alongside the growing presence of motor cars, their engines humming softly, blending into the background rather than dominating it. The air carries the ordinary sounds of daily life. Footsteps against stone, distant conversation, the occasional call of a vendor. Everything feels grounded, stable, and secure. Along wide boulevards, shop windows are arranged with care and quiet pride. Tailors display fine fabrics. Watchmakers present polished timepieces, and bakers set out fresh bread each morning. People move without urgency, pausing to look, to speak, to exist within the unspoken understanding that there is always more time. Conversations drift easily, touching on small matters, family, work, minor inconveniences. There is no sense of pressure, no hint that anything beyond the ordinary demands attention. Life feels contained within its routines, and those routines feel dependable. At the train station, there is motion, but not chaos. Steam rises in slow, rolling clouds as locomotives prepare for departure. Trains arrive and leave with quiet precision, linking cities and countries in a network that reflects both progress and confidence. Passengers step aboard with modest luggage, traveling for work or leisure, often crossing borders without concern. The railway symbolizes connection, a belief that the world is becoming more unified rather than divided. Movement feels natural, not threatening. In markets, daily life unfolds in familiar patterns. Vendors arrange produce and goods with practiced care, calling out to customers in voices shaped by years of repetition. People gather not only to buy, but to talk, to exchange news, to maintain the quiet social bonds that define their communities. Children move through the crowds, their laughter rising above the steady murmur of conversation. Everything feels rooted, continuous, as though it has always been this way and always will be. Even beyond the cities, in the countryside, the same sense of continuity persists. Fields are worked according to seasons that feel unchanged by time, and villages remain small, close-knit, and steady. Life moves more slowly here, but it carries the same quiet certainty. Whether in a crowded urban street or a distant rural field, there is a shared belief that the world is stable, that tomorrow will follow the same gentle patterns as today. And yet, beneath this surface, something less visible begins to take shape. It does not interrupt daily life, nor does it announce itself loudly. It exists instead in the background, in political discussions, in newspaper articles, in the language of leaders. Nations grow more conscious of themselves, more aware of their power, their identity, their place in the world. National pride strengthens, slowly and quietly, encouraged by culture and history. It does not yet feel dangerous, but it creates subtle divisions, lines that are drawn without being fully noticed. Occasionally, newspapers mention tensions between countries, disagreements over territory, influence, alliances. These stories appear and fade, often overshadowed by more immediate concerns. For most people, they remain distant and abstract, part of a world that feels separate from everyday life. There is a general belief that such tensions are manageable, that diplomacy will always find a solution. War, if it is considered at all, feels like something that belongs to the past, not to the present. This belief is strengthened by a sense of progress. Technology advances, industries expand, and societies become more connected. There is quiet confidence that the world is moving forward, becoming more rational, less prone to conflict. The idea that a single event could disrupt this stability seems unlikely, almost unthinkable. And then, in the summer of 1914, something small and distant occurs. In a city far from the daily routines of most Europeans, an archduke is assassinated. The news arrives slowly at first, carried through newspapers and conversations. It is discussed, certainly, but without urgency. For many, it feels like an isolated incident, tragic but contained. Political figures are sometimes targeted, and while such events are unsettling, they do not usually alter the course of ordinary life. At first, nothing seems to change. The streets remain busy, the markets continue to open, and trains run as they always have. People read the news, perhaps pause to consider it, and then return to their routines. The sense of stability holds, even as the story begins to spread. But beneath the surface, the response is already beginning. Governments react not with calm detachment, but with calculation. Alliances, carefully constructed over years, begin to activate in ways that are not immediately visible to the public. Decisions are made behind closed doors, each one influenced by obligations, fears, and expectations. What appears to be a regional conflict starts to draw in other nations, not all at once, but step by step. The process is gradual, almost quiet, like a series of small movements that do not seem significant on their own. One country makes a demand, another responds. Deadlines are issued, alliances invoked. Each action leads to another, forming a chain that becomes increasingly difficult to break. From the perspective of everyday life, these changes are distant, unfolding in a world that still feels removed, but the pace begins to quicken. News becomes more frequent, more urgent. The language shifts, less certain, more serious. There is talk of mobilization, of preparation, of the possibility of conflict. Still, many believe it will be brief, limited, controlled. There is confidence that even if war comes, it will not last long, that it will resolve quickly, as conflicts often have in the past. And then, almost without warning, the shift becomes undeniable. Countries begin to declare war, one after another, in rapid succession. Alliances pull nations into the conflict, transforming what began as a regional crisis into something far larger. The scale of it is not immediately understood, but its presence is felt. The world that once seemed stable now begins to move in a different direction. Normal life does not stop instantly, but it starts to change. There is a new tension in the air, a sense that something significant is unfolding. Trains that once carried passengers now begin to carry soldiers. Conversations shift from the ordinary to the uncertain. The routines remain, but they feel different, less secure, as though they are being held in place by habit rather than confidence. The calm that once defined Europe does not disappear all at once. Instead, it fades slowly, replaced by something less certain, less predictable. What was once assumed to be permanent begins to feel fragile. The illusion of stability, so deeply rooted in daily life, starts to give way. And as the world continues to move forward, step by step, the full reality of what has begun is still not entirely clear. But the direction has changed, and there is no easy way to return. The quiet rhythm of ordinary life has been interrupted, not by a single dramatic moment, but by a series of small, connected events that have reshaped everything. And the calm, once so familiar, is beginning to slip away. At first, the war does not feel like something distant anymore. It moves closer, not all at once, but gradually, until it begins to settle into the edges of your daily life. What once appeared in newspapers as small columns of text now takes up entire pages. Conversations shift, no longer circling around routine concerns, but returning again and again to the same subject. There is a sense that something important is unfolding, and that it somehow involves you, even if you do not yet understand how. You begin to notice the posters. They appear on walls, on street corners, near train stations, and outside shops you pass each day. Bright, deliberate, and impossible to ignore, they carry simple messages. They speak directly, often urgently, but always with a certain confidence. They promise purpose, direction, and belonging. The figures on them stand tall and composed, dressed in uniform, looking outward as if they already understand something you do not. Their expressions are steady, certain. There is no hesitation in their faces, no suggestion of doubt. The message is clear, even when it is not spoken aloud. You are needed. At first, you only observe. You pass by, noticing them without stopping for long. But over time, they become harder to ignore. They are repeated, consistent, and reinforced by everything around them. Newspapers echo the same tone, describing the war as necessary, even inevitable. There's talk of duty, of honor, of defending something larger than yourself. The language is calm, but persuasive. It does not demand, it assumes. Around you, others begin to respond. Friends, neighbors, and acquaintances start to talk about enlisting. Some speak with quiet determination, others with a kind of restrained excitement. There is a shared belief that the war will not last long, that it will be resolved quickly, perhaps even decisively. Many imagine it as a brief interruption, something that must be faced and finished before life can return to normal. There is confidence in this assumption, reinforced by the idea that modern nations, with all their organization and power, would not allow a conflict to stretch on unnecessarily. You hear phrases repeated often, spoken casually, almost reassuringly, that it will be over by Christmas, that it is simply a matter of time. This belief settles in slowly. It does not arrive as a sudden conviction, but as something that grows through repetition. The idea of a short war makes the decision feel smaller, more manageable. It transforms something uncertain into something that appears temporary. And then there is the pressure, though it is rarely direct. It exists in the spaces between conversations, in the way people speak and the things they choose not to say. Those who enlist are spoken of with quiet respect. Their decisions are acknowledged, sometimes admired, even if only subtly. Those who hesitate are not openly criticized, but there's a sense of difference, of separation. It is not enough to continue as before. The world has shifted, and remaining still begins to feel like a choice in itself. You begin to consider it more seriously. The idea no longer feels abstract. It becomes something you weigh, something you turn over in your mind during quiet moments. You think about what it would mean to leave, even for a short time. You imagine the structure of military life, the clarity of having a defined role. There is something almost comforting in that idea, the sense of purpose, of direction, of knowing exactly what is expected of you. At the same time, there is uncertainty, though it remains difficult to define. The war is still distant enough that its realities are unclear. You do not yet picture trenches, or mud, or exhaustion. Instead, the image that forms is shaped by what you have seen and heard. Order, movement, and a kind of controlled conflict that follows rules you believe must exist. Eventually, the decision becomes less about certainty and more about alignment. Others are going. The world is moving in a particular direction, and remaining outside of it begins to feel increasingly unnatural. There is a quiet momentum that builds, not forcing you forward, but making it harder to stay where you are. The sense of belonging, of participating in something shared, grows stronger. And so, you enlist. The process itself is simple, almost understated. You step forward, give your name, and become part of something larger. There is no dramatic moment, no sudden realization, just a series of small actions that lead you from one life into another. Papers are signed, instructions are given, and before long, your path is set. Around you, others do the same. There is a sense of order in it, a calm efficiency. Lines form and move steadily. Voices remain measured. Everything feels organized, as though it has all been planned in advance. The scale of what is happening is not fully visible, but it can be felt in the quiet consistency of it all. As you leave behind your familiar routines, there is still the underlying belief that this is temporary, that whatever lies ahead will be resolved, and that you will return to the life you have known. This assumption remains strong, even as the world continues to shift. The war, at this stage, still feels contained within certain boundaries, structured, manageable, finite. But as you move forward, step by step, those boundaries begin to blur. The optimism that surrounds you does not disappear, but starts to take on a different quality, one shaped less by certainty and more by repetition. It continues because it must, because it holds everything in place. Yet beneath it, something quieter begins to form, a sense that the reality ahead may not align with the expectations that brought you here. For now, though, that realization remains distant. You move with the others, carried by the same steady momentum, guided by the same quiet confidence that this will be over soon, that everything will return to the way it was. And as you take each step forward, the distance between expectation and reality begins, slowly, to close. The journey to the front feels longer than expected, not because of the distance, but because of the gradual shift in atmosphere as you move closer to the war. At first, it still resembles something familiar. The train carries you through open countryside, past fields and villages that seem untouched, where life continues at its usual pace. People go about their days, unaware or perhaps deliberately distant from what lies ahead. From your window, everything appears calm, almost unchanged, and for a moment it is possible to believe that the war exists somewhere else, separate from the world you have known. But as the train continues, the signs begin to change in subtle ways. The stations become quieter, more functional, less welcoming. The people you see are fewer, and those who remain carry a different expression, more reserved, more watchful. When you finally disembark, there is no dramatic moment to mark your arrival, only a quiet sense that things are no longer the same. The air feels heavier, carrying unfamiliar scents that you cannot immediately place. You are directed forward with little explanation, moving along roads that are worn and uneven, surrounded by others who walk in silence or speak in low, measured tones. The further you go, the more the environment begins to shift. The ground is no longer firm beneath your feet. It softens, becoming damp, then thick, then difficult to move through. Mud begins to cling to your boots, adding weight with every step, slowing your pace in a way that feels constant and unavoidable. The first sound you notice is not loud, but distant, a low, irregular rumble that seems to come from beyond the horizon. At first, it is easy to ignore, blending into the background like distant thunder, but does not fade. Instead, it repeats again and again, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, but always present. As you continue forward, the sound grows clearer, more defined. It is not natural, not part of the landscape, but something imposed upon it. Each distant explosion carries a dull, heavy weight, followed by a silence that feels just as significant. Then, gradually, the other sounds begin to emerge. Voices, but not the casual conversations you are used to, short, direct, often restrained. The movement of equipment, the shifting of wood and metal, the quiet but constant activity of people who are no longer at ease. Everything feels purposeful, but not calm. There is an underlying tension, something unspoken but widely understood. The smell becomes more noticeable as you move closer. It is not a single scent, but a mixture: damp earth, unwashed clothing, smoke, and something else that lingers just beneath the surface, difficult to identify, but impossible to ignore. It settles into the air, constant and inescapable, becoming something you are aware of without fully understanding. And then, almost without warning, you see it. The trench does not appear as you might have imagined. It is not clean or structured in any orderly way, but uneven, worn, and shaped by constant use. The edges are reinforced with wood and sandbags, though many appear strained, sagging under the weight of the earth around them. The ground within is not solid, but thick and shifting, marked by footprints that quickly fill with water. It feels less like a constructed space and more like something carved out of necessity, forced into existence rather than carefully built. As you step down into it, the change is immediate. The walls rise around you, narrowing your view, enclosing you in a space that feels both protective and confining. Movement becomes more restricted. You're no longer walking freely, but navigating through a path that dictates where you can go and how you can move. The mud is deeper here, pulling at your boots, making each step deliberate. The air feels heavier, the sounds more contained, echoing slightly within the narrow space. Around you, others continue their routines, but there is no sense of ease in their movements. Everything is measured, controlled, shaped by experience you do not yet have. They step carefully, speak quietly, and remain aware of their surroundings in a way that feels constant. There is no panic, no visible fear, but there is also no relaxation. It is a state of ongoing alertness, maintained without interruption. The contrast with what you expected becomes clearer with each passing moment. The war you imagined, structured, organized, perhaps even predictable, does not exist here. Instead, there is disorder, not chaotic in the sense of confusion, but in the sense of constant unpredictability. The ground shifts, the sounds change, and nothing feels entirely stable. Even standing still requires effort, as the mud pulls and the space confines. As you remain there, taking it in slowly, the psychological weight begins to settle. It is not immediate or overwhelming, but gradual, like the environment itself. The realization does not come as a single thought, but as a series of small observations that begin to connect. This is not temporary in the way you had imagined. It is not distant, nor is it contained. It is immediate, physical, and inescapable. The distant rumble continues, now joined by sharper, more defined sounds that cut through the air without warning. Each one draws your attention, even when you try to ignore it. Time begins to feel different here, measured less by hours and more by moments, by sounds, by movements, by the quiet spaces in between. And as you stand within the trench, surrounded by mud, noise, and the steady presence of something you are only beginning to understand, the final distance between expectation and reality quietly disappears. Life in the trench does not unfold in clear beginnings or endings, but in a slow, continuous cycle that repeats itself with little variation. There is no true mourning in the way you once understood it, only a gradual awareness that another period of time has passed. You wake not because you are rested, but because you must. The ground beneath you is uneven and damp, offering little comfort, and sleep comes in fragments rather than full stretches. When you open your eyes, nothing feels entirely new. The same narrow walls surround you, the same weight of air presses in, and the same distant sounds remind you that the world beyond the trench is always active, always moving. The day begins quietly, almost automatically. There is no need for instruction because the routine has already taken hold. You adjust your position, clear the mud from your boots as best you can, and prepare for what is expected. Movement is slow, deliberate, shaped by the conditions around you. Even simple actions require effort. The mud resists, the space confines, and everything feels slightly more difficult than it should be. Yet this difficulty is constant, and because it is constant, it becomes something you begin to accept. Food arrives, or is distributed, in a way that feels more functional than nourishing. Meals are simple, often cold, and eaten quickly, not out of urgency, but out of habit. There is little conversation during these moments. Eating is not a break in the day, but a part of the routine, no different from any other task. You eat because it is time to eat, not because you are hungry in any meaningful way. The taste barely registers after a while, replaced by the familiarity of repetition. Standing guard becomes one of the defining elements of your time in the trench. You take your position, looking out across a landscape that rarely changes but never feels safe. The act itself is simple. Watch, listen, remain aware. But the effort lies in maintaining that awareness over long periods of time. Nothing may happen for hours, and yet you cannot relax. Your attention must remain steady, even when there is nothing to see, nothing to hear beyond the distant, persistent sounds that never fully fade. Time stretches during these moments. Minutes feel longer, not because they are filled with activity, but because they are not. You stand, you observe, you wait. The repetition becomes almost hypnotic, a rhythm that settles into your thoughts. There is a certain stillness in it, but it is not peaceful. It is a stillness defined by tension, by the knowledge that something could happen at any moment, even if it rarely does. When your shift ends, there is no clear sense of relief, only a transition into the next part of the cycle. Others take your place, and you move back into the trench where the routine continues. Tasks vary slightly, repairing sections of the trench, moving supplies, reinforcing weakened areas, but they follow the same pattern of steady, repetitive effort. Each action blends into the next, creating a sense that time is not moving forward, but circling back on itself. Rotations between the front line and the reserve trench offer some variation, but not as much as you might expect. Moving away from the front provides a small degree of distance from the immediate tension, yet the environment remains largely the same. The mud is still there, the routines persist, and the sounds of war, though sometimes quieter, never disappear entirely. The change is subtle, more a shift in intensity than a complete difference. You are still within the same system, still part of the same ongoing cycle. Sleep, when it comes, is inconsistent. It arrives in short intervals, often interrupted, never fully satisfying. You rest when you can, not when you are ready. The conditions do not allow for deep sleep, and even when your eyes close, your awareness does not fully fade. Sounds continue in the background, sometimes distant, sometimes close enough to draw you back into wakefulness. Over time, the lack of sleep becomes less noticeable in a direct way, but it shapes everything you do. Movements slow slightly, thoughts become more repetitive, and the line between waking and resting begins to blur. The constant tension is perhaps the most difficult part to define, because it is always present. It does not rise and fall dramatically, but remains steady, like the distant rumble of artillery that never fully stops. You become used to it, in a way, but never comfortable. It exists in the background of every action, every thought, influencing how you move, how you speak, how you exist within the trench. Even in moments of relative quiet, it remains unchanged. Days pass, though they do not feel distinct from one another. There are no clear markers to separate them, no strong sense of progression. Instead, everything blends together into a continuous experience, shaped by repetition and routine. You wake, you move, you eat, you stand guard, you rest, and then you begin again. The cycle does not break, and over time, it becomes the structure of your entire existence. And within this repetition, something begins to shift, not in the environment, which remains largely the same, but in your perception of it. What once felt unfamiliar starts to feel expected. The mud, the routines, the constant tension, they no longer stand out in the same way. They become the baseline, the condition against which everything else is measured. The world you knew before, with its clear days and defined routines, begins to feel distant, almost abstract. In its place is this steady, unchanging rhythm, where each moment leads quietly into the next, and where life is no longer measured by what happens, but by the simple fact that the cycle continues. And so, without pause or interruption, it does. The trench is never truly dry. Even on days when the sky holds back its rain, the ground beneath you remains saturated, as though it has absorbed more water than it can ever release. Moisture lingers in every surface, in every layer of earth and wood, settling into the fabric of your clothing and the weight of your boots. It is not something that comes and goes, but something constant, something that defines the space you occupy. The longer you remain, the more it feels as though dryness itself belongs to another world, one that exists only in memory. When it rains, the trench changes quickly. Water gathers in shallow pools at first, forming around your feet, filling the impressions left by movement. But it does not stop there. The ground cannot absorb it fast enough, and so it begins to rise, slowly at first, then with quiet persistence. The narrow pathways that once allowed for careful movement become submerged, turning each step into an effort against resistance. The mud thickens, loosens, shifts beneath you, making it difficult to find stable footing. You do not walk so much as pull yourself forward, lifting each foot with deliberate effort, feeling the ground hold onto you as though it does not intend to let go. The walls of the trench, held together by wood and sandbags, begin to show the strain. The sandbags, once firm, are softened by constant exposure, their surfaces darkened and weakened. Some sag under their own weight. Others split open slowly, spilling their contents into the trench below. The wooden supports creak and shift, their structure compromised by the same dampness that fills the air. There is no sudden collapse, no dramatic break, but a gradual giving way, a slow loss of strength that continues without pause. At times, sections of the trench begin to slide. The earth loosens, edges crumble, and the walls seem to lean inward, narrowing the space even further. It happens quietly, almost subtly, yet the effect is immediate. The already confined space becomes tighter, more restrictive, forcing you to adjust your movements even more carefully. There is a constant awareness that the structure around you is not entirely stable, that it is being held together not by permanence, but by ongoing effort. The dampness seeps into everything. Your clothing never fully dries, no matter how long you wear it. It clings to your skin, heavy and cold, creating a sensation that does not fade. Even when you are still, the feeling remains, pressing in, reminding you of the environment that surrounds you. Your hands, your feet, your entire body begin to carry this constant weight, as though the trench itself is extended into you. Rest becomes difficult in a way that is not immediately obvious. There are moments when you are not required to move, when you are given the opportunity to sit or lie down. But even then, comfort does not follow. The ground beneath you is uneven and wet, offering no stable place to settle. You shift your position, trying to find some small relief, but the conditions do not allow for it. The dampness remains, the cold persists, and any attempt at rest feels incomplete, interrupted before it can fully take hold. Movement, too, is shaped by these conditions. Nothing is simple, nothing is effortless. Each step requires attention, each action slowed by the resistance of the mud and the narrowness of the space. Carrying equipment becomes more demanding, not because of its weight alone, but because of the environment through which it must be moved. Even turning, even adjusting your position, becomes something that must be done with care. The air itself feels heavier here, thick with moisture and the lingering effects of everything around you. It is not suffocating in a sudden way, but in a gradual, persistent manner. You breathe, but the air does not feel entirely fresh. It carries the scent of damp earth, of worn materials, of a space that is constantly in the process of breaking down. This sense of decay is not dramatic or immediate, but steady and unavoidable, present in every part of the trench. Over time, the distinction between the environment and your experience within it begins to fade. The mud is not just beneath your feet, but part of how you move. The dampness is not just in the air, but part of how you feel. The decay is not just in the structure of the trench, but in the slow wearing down of everything within it. It becomes difficult to separate yourself from these conditions, as though they have become the defining elements of your existence here. The repetition continues, as it always does, but it is shaped by this constant presence. Each day feels heavier, not because of any single event, but because of the accumulation of these conditions. The trench does not change quickly, but it does not remain the same either. It shifts, it settles, it slowly gives way, and you remain within it, adapting not by choice but by necessity. And as you stand, or sit, or attempt to rest within this narrow, damp space, there's a quiet realization that nothing here is truly stable. The ground beneath you moves, the walls around you weaken, and the air itself feels weighted with the passage of time. Everything is slowly changing, slowly breaking down, and there is no clear point at which it stops. There is only the steady, unending presence of mud, water, and decay surrounding you, pressing in and shaping every moment you remain within it. The trench is never empty. Even when it appears still, when movement slows and voices fade into the background, there is always something else present, something small and persistent that shares the same confined space. At first, you notice it only in passing, a quick movement at the edge of your vision, a faint sound beneath the constant rhythm of the trench. It does not demand your attention immediately, but over time, it becomes impossible to ignore. The rats are the most visible. They move along the edges of the trench, slipping between gaps in the wood and beneath loose sections of earth. They are not cautious in the way you might expect. Instead, they move with a kind of familiarity, as though they belong here as much as anything else. At night, they become more active, their presence more noticeable in the quiet. You may hear them before you see them, the soft movement, the subtle shifting of debris. When you do see them, they are larger than you imagined, well-fed and unafraid, shaped by the conditions of the trench. They gather where the environment allows, drawn by what is left behind, by what cannot be easily removed. Their presence is not sudden or surprising, but constant. They move freely, unbothered by the routines of those around them, as though they exist outside of the structure that governs everything else. You learn to notice them without reacting, to acknowledge their presence without engaging with it. There is little else you can do. The lice are different. They are not something you see moving through the trench, but something you feel, something that remains with you. They settle into your clothing, into the seams and folds that are never fully cleaned or dried. At first, it is a mild irritation, easy to dismiss, but it does not go away. It builds slowly, becoming more persistent, more difficult to ignore. You scratch without thinking, adjusting your clothing in small, repetitive movements that offer only brief relief. Over time, the discomfort deepens. It is no longer just an irritation, but something that affects your entire sense of rest. Even when you're still, even when you're trying to sleep, the sensation remains. It becomes part of the background of your experience, another constant layer added to everything else. You are aware of it even when you are not actively thinking about it, and this awareness never fully fades. The illness that follows, what is often called trench fever, does not arrive dramatically. It comes on gradually, with a sense of fatigue that feels heavier than usual, accompanied by aches that settle into your body without clear cause. It does not stop the routine, but it makes each part of it more difficult. Movements slow slightly, concentration becomes harder to maintain, and the already limited rest feels even less effective. The trench itself offers no escape from any of this. The conditions that allow these infestations to exist are the same conditions you must live within. The dampness, the lack of cleanliness, the constant presence of decay, all of it contributes to an environment where nothing can be fully removed or avoided. Attempts to manage it are temporary at best. Clothing can be adjusted, small efforts can be made, but the underlying problem remains unchanged. This creates a sense of inescapability that is difficult to ignore. It is not just the physical presence of rats or lice, but the understanding that they are part of the environment, just as much as the mud or the walls of the trench. They are not passing through. They are established, constant, and unaffected by the routines that shape your day. The psychological effect of this builds slowly, in the same way everything else does. There is no single moment when it becomes overwhelming, but rather a gradual accumulation of small discomforts and constant awareness. You begin to anticipate their presence, to expect it even in moments when you do not immediately notice it. This anticipation becomes its own form of tension, a quiet, persistent layer that sits beneath everything else. Moments that might otherwise offer rest or stillness are altered by this awareness. Sitting or lying down does not bring the same sense of pause, because the environment does not allow for it. Even in stillness, there is movement, however small, however subtle. Even in quiet, there is the sense that something else is present. Over time, your response changes. What once felt unfamiliar becomes expected, then routine. You no longer react in the same way, not because the conditions have improved, but because your ability to respond has shifted. There's a kind of acceptance, though not a comfortable one. It is simply the result of repetition, of being exposed to the same conditions again and again until they no longer stand out in the same way. And yet, despite this adjustment, the effect remains. The trench is not just a place defined by its physical structure, but by everything that exists within it, seen and unseen. The presence of infestation adds another layer to an environment already shaped by difficulty, reinforcing the sense that nothing here is entirely under control. As you continue through the routine, moving from one task to the next, this presence follows you, quiet and constant. It does not interrupt the cycle, but it becomes part of it, woven into each moment in a way that cannot be separated. And so, like the mud beneath your feet and the dampness in the air, it remains persistent, unavoidable, and always just beneath the surface of your awareness. The sound is always there. It does not begin or end in any clear way, but continues without pause, settling into the background of everything you experience. At first, you try to separate it from your thoughts, to treat it as something distant, something that belongs to the world beyond the trench. But over time, it becomes impossible to divide the two. The sound is no longer separate from your surroundings. It is part of them, woven into the air itself, as constant as your own breathing. It begins as a low, distant rhythm, a steady rumble that rolls across the landscape without urgency. It is not loud enough to demand your full attention, but it is present enough that you cannot ignore it completely. You hear it as you move, as you stand, as you attempt to rest. It repeats again and again, never fully stopping, never resolving into silence. The consistency of it gives it a strange quality, almost predictable, as though it follows a pattern you cannot quite understand but have come to expect. Then, within that rhythm, other sounds emerge. There is a sharp, rising note that cuts through the background, the sound of a shell moving through the air. It begins faintly, almost indistinct, and then grows clearer, more defined. It is not a long sound, but it stretches just enough to draw your attention, just enough to create a moment of awareness before what follows. You do not always know where it will land, only that it is moving, that it is approaching, and that its path will end somewhere close enough to matter. The explosion that follows does not always feel as loud as you expect, but it carries weight. The ground responds, shifting slightly beneath you, the air tightening for a brief moment before settling again. Sometimes it is distant, blending back into the ongoing rhythm, and sometimes it is closer, interrupting your thoughts, breaking the pattern just long enough to remind you that the sound is not abstract. It is physical, immediate, and always capable of reaching you. These moments repeat, not in perfect intervals, but often enough that they begin to feel connected. The rising whistle, the brief pause, the dull impact. It forms a sequence that your mind starts to follow without conscious effort. You begin to anticipate it, not with certainty, but with a quiet expectation. Each sound leads to the next, and even when there is variation, the structure remains familiar. There are times when the bombardment intensifies, when the rhythm becomes faster, more compressed. The space between sounds shortens, and the individual moments begin to overlap. The distinction between one explosion and the next becomes less clear, merging into a continuous presence that fills the air. During these periods, it is difficult to focus on anything else. The sound dominates, not through sudden force, but through persistence, through the way it surrounds and contains everything within it. And then, just as gradually, it slows. The intervals widen, the rhythm stretches out, and the intensity fades back into something more distant. The individual sounds become easier to separate again, each one standing on its own before giving way to the next. It is not a return to quiet, but a return to the baseline, to the steady pattern that never fully disappears. It is in these quieter moments that something else becomes noticeable. The absence of sound, when it comes, is not complete, but it is enough to feel different. The rumble fades, the sharp whistles disappear, and for a brief period, the air seems to hold still. At first, this might seem like relief, a pause in the constant presence that has shaped every moment. But the silence carries its own weight. Without the familiar rhythm, there is nothing to follow, nothing to anticipate. The structure you have grown used to is gone, replaced by uncertainty. In this silence, your awareness sharpens. Every small sound becomes more noticeable. The movement of someone nearby, the shifting of equipment, the subtle changes in the environment. Without the larger sounds to absorb your attention, these smaller details stand out more clearly. The quiet is not empty, but filled with possibility, with the sense that something may begin again at any moment. This makes the silence feel heavier than the noise that came before it. The rhythm of bombardment, though constant, offers a kind of predictability. You know it will continue, that it will repeat, that it follows a pattern you have learned to recognize. But silence offers no such structure. It is open, undefined, and because of that, more difficult to settle into. You find yourself listening more closely during these moments, not because there is more to hear, but because there is less. The absence becomes something you are aware of, something that shapes your thoughts in the same way the sound once did. You wait, not for anything specific, but for the return of what you now recognize as familiar. And eventually, it does return. The distant rumble begins again, low and steady, re-establishing the rhythm that has come to define your experience. The whistles follow, then the impacts, and the cycle resumes. The sound fills the space once more, replacing the silence with something that feels, in a strange way, more stable. Over time, this pattern becomes something you no longer question. It is simply how the world is here, structured not by quiet, but by repetition, by the continuous rise and fall of sound that never fully disappears. The noise does not fade into the background completely, but it becomes something you carry with you, something that shapes the way you think, the way you move, the way you experience each moment. And as it continues, steady and unending, it settles into a rhythm that feels almost hypnotic. Not because it is calming, but because it is constant, because it leaves no space for anything else to take its place. The order does not arrive with drama. It comes in the same way most things here do. Quietly, almost matter-of-factly, passed down through a chain of voices that have already accepted what it means. There is no confusion in the message, only confirmation. Something that has been expected for a while is now becoming immediate. The routine shifts, not suddenly, but with a noticeable tightening, as if the entire trench has drawn a slow breath and is now holding it. Preparation begins in a controlled, almost mechanical way. There is no chaos yet, only procedure. Equipment is checked, adjusted, and rechecked. Ammunition is distributed with practiced efficiency. Rifles are handled carefully, not with urgency, but with repetition born from familiarity. Everyone moves within a structure that feels rehearsed, even if the moment itself is not. The actions are simple, but they carry weight because of what they lead toward, even if no one speaks that part aloud. As time passes, the atmosphere changes subtly. Conversations become shorter, more functional. Silence appears more often between instructions. People begin to focus inward, each person contained within their own thoughts. The trench, which usually feels cramped and noisy in its own way, becomes quieter, as if even the environment is aware of what is approaching. There's still movement, still activity, but it is restrained, measured, almost careful. When the moment finally comes, there is no clear boundary that separates waiting from action. It simply transitions. You are told to move, and movement begins. The trench, once a place of confinement, becomes something to leave behind. The steps upward are slow, deliberate, shaped by the weight of everything leading to this point. The ladder is narrow, worn by repetition, and as you climb, the sound of the trench behind you begins to fade, replaced by something broader, more open, and immediately more exposed. Reaching the top is not a dramatic emergence, but a gradual exposure. The world opens in front of you in a way that feels both expansive and unwelcoming. The ground beyond the trench is uneven, broken, and stretched out in a way that makes distance difficult to judge. There is no clear path, no guidance other than the direction you are expected to move. Everything ahead feels uncertain, not because it is unknown, but because it is visibly unforgiving. And then you move forward. Crossing no man's land is not a single action, but a series of movements that blend together. Each step requires effort, not only because of the terrain, but because of what surrounds it. The ground is unstable, shaped by earlier events that have left it uneven and difficult to traverse. Movement is slow, not by choice, but by necessity. There is no rhythm to follow, no structure to guide you forward, only distance and the need to reduce it. As you advance, the environment begins to respond. The distant sense of observation becomes immediate presence. The space that once felt open now feels exposed. Sound begins to break through the air in sharp, abrupt ways, interrupting the fragile continuity of movement. It does not build gradually like before, but arrives suddenly, cutting through the space with precision. Each moment feels disconnected from the next, as if the ground itself cannot hold continuity. The machine gun fire begins to define the space in a way that is difficult to ignore. It is not a single sound, but a pattern, repetitive, mechanical, unrelenting. It does not follow the rhythm of anything natural, and because of that, it feels detached from everything else. Movement becomes more instinctive here. There is little time for thought, only reaction. The space around you is no longer neutral. It is active, reacting, shaping every decision you make without pause. Around you, the environment shifts into something less defined. Dust, movement, and sound blend together in ways that make it difficult to separate one moment from another. The sense of direction begins to weaken. What was once forward becomes uncertain, not because it has changed, but because it is no longer clearly distinguishable from anything else happening around you. There is no clear escalation, only continuation. The chaos does not build toward a climax in a structured way. It simply exists, fully formed, and continues without interruption. Each step forward is part of it, not separate from it. The idea of control becomes less relevant as the situation unfolds, replaced by something more immediate and physical. And yet, within this, there is still movement. Not coordinated, not precise, but ongoing. The act of moving forward continues because it must, because stopping is not part of the sequence that has already been set in motion. Each decision is smaller than the last, reduced to the next step, the next moment, the next breath. The sound does not stop. The space does not stabilize. The distance does not clarify. And eventually, the moment that was always approaching is no longer ahead of you. It is where you are. By the time the war settles into its full form, it is no longer defined by movement alone, but by the tools that shape every movement within it. What began as a conflict carried by soldiers and strategies gradually transforms into something driven by machines, by systems of production and destruction operating on a scale that feels increasingly detached from individual experience. The battlefield is no longer simply a place where armies meet, but an environment structured by technology, where survival is determined as much by equipment as by presence. One of the most defining elements of this new kind of warfare is the machine gun. It does not require complexity in its understanding, only recognition of its effect. It is steady, repetitive, and efficient in a way that removes uncertainty from its function. Where earlier forms of combat relied on movement and timing between individuals, this weapon compresses space into something controlled and continuous. Open ground becomes something to avoid entirely, not because of terrain, but because of what occupies the space itself. The result is a shift in how distance is perceived. Movement across even short stretches becomes a calculated risk rather than a simple action. Barbed wire reinforces this change in a different way. It does not act through force in the same direct manner, but through restriction. It reshapes the battlefield into segments, dividing space into areas that are accessible and areas that are not. What once might have been open ground becomes layered with barriers that slow, entangle, and redirect movement. It does not need to actively engage to be effective. Its presence alone alters behavior. It turns motion into something that must be considered carefully, even before it begins. Above and beyond these ground-level changes, artillery defines the broader structure of the war. It operates at a scale that removes visibility from its effects. Unlike direct confrontation, it does not require proximity. It shapes the battlefield from a distance, influencing areas without direct contact. The sound associated with it becomes familiar over time, not because it loses significance, but because it becomes constant. It arrives in cycles, sometimes distant, sometimes closer, but always present in some form. Its impact is not limited to specific moments, but extends across entire stretches of time and space, making it one of the dominant forces shaping the environment. What makes artillery particularly significant is not only its power, but its reach. It creates conditions that affect movement before any physical contact occurs. Positions are chosen with caution, not because of what is immediately visible, but because of what might arrive without warning. The landscape becomes defined by potential rather than presence, shaped by possibilities that remain active even in moments of stillness. As the war progresses further, a new element appears that changes the nature of the battlefield once again. The introduction of armored vehicles, tanks, brings a different kind of presence to the conflict. Unlike earlier weapons, they move through space in a way that combines protection and force, altering expectations of what could be crossed and what cannot. Their arrival does not immediately replace existing methods, but it introduces a new layer to the structure of warfare. They move slowly, but with persistence, reshaping obstacles rather than avoiding them. Their presence changes how certain positions are held and how certain lines are understood, adding another dimension to an already complex environment. However, even these developments do not exist in isolation. They are part of a larger transformation, one that defines the war at its core: industrialization. The conflict is no longer supported only by individual nations in a traditional sense, but by entire systems of production that extend far beyond the battlefield. Factories, supply lines, transportation networks, and logistical systems become as important as the soldiers themselves. Weapons are produced continuously, in quantities that reflect not just need, but capacity. The scale of output changes the nature of the war, making it less about isolated engagements and more about sustained capability over time. This industrial scale introduces a new form of distance between action and consequence. What is produced far from the front becomes immediately relevant to it. Decisions made in factories and administrative centers influence conditions on the ground in direct and ongoing ways. The battlefield is no longer an isolated space, but the endpoint of a much larger system that extends far beyond it. From a detached perspective, the war becomes less about individual moments and more about patterns of production and deployment. The weapons themselves are not temporary tools, but part of a continuous cycle that maintains the conflict. Each development builds upon the last, not necessarily changing the nature of violence, but increasing its scale, efficiency, and reach. What remains consistent throughout all of this is the reduction of unpredictability in some areas and its amplification in others. Certain aspects of combat become more structured, more mechanical, while others become more uncertain due to scale and intensity. The result is not simplification, but expansion, a widening of what warfare includes and how it is conducted. In this environment, the individual becomes less central to the structure of conflict, not absent, but repositioned within a system that operates beyond any single perspective. The war is no longer shaped solely by human intention in the immediate sense, but by the interaction of technology, industry, and strategy on a large and continuous scale. And as these elements continue to evolve, the battlefield becomes less a place defined by people, and more a system defined by the tools they have created. The change does not arrive with warning in any familiar sense. It is not something you see approaching, nor something you can prepare for through sight alone. At first, it is only a shift in the air, a difference so subtle that it is difficult to distinguish from the usual conditions of the battlefield. But gradually, it becomes clear that something has altered the environment in a way that cannot be ignored. There is a moment when the routine of the front is interrupted not by sound or impact, but by awareness. A signal is given, passed along quickly, without explanation. Those who have experience react immediately, while others hesitate, unsure of what has changed. Then comes the realization that this is not like the usual patterns of artillery or movement. This is something else entirely, something that does not behave in the same predictable rhythm. The first exposure is confusing more than anything else. It does not resemble the physical force of explosions or the visible presence of gunfire. Instead, it is the air itself that becomes uncertain. A strange haze appears, low to the ground, moving slowly but steadily across the landscape. It does not announce itself loudly, but its presence is unmistakable once recognized. The reaction is immediate among those who understand what it means. Movement becomes urgent, not chaotic, but directed toward preparation. Masks are reached for quickly, not as an afterthought, but as a necessity that has already been anticipated. The act of putting them on is practiced, almost automatic for some, while others struggle briefly with unfamiliarity. The mask changes the way everything is experienced. Breathing becomes deliberate, filtered, mechanical. Sound is altered, reduced, as though the world has been placed behind a layer of separation that cannot be removed. The air, once taken for granted even in difficult conditions, becomes something to be questioned. Every breath requires awareness. Every moment outside of protection carries uncertainty. The battlefield, already shaped by distance and technology, now includes an element that cannot be seen in the same way as other weapons. It moves without structure, filling spaces unevenly, settling where it is least expected. Chlorine gas is one of the first forms encountered in this way. It is not fast in the way a projectile is fast, but it is persistent. It moves with the wind, following the shape of the terrain, entering spaces gradually. Its presence is not immediate in all places at once, but spreads in a way that makes timing unpredictable. It forces reaction not at the moment of contact, but in anticipation of contact that may already be occurring elsewhere. Later, mustard gas introduces a different kind of presence. It does not rely on immediate recognition. It lingers, remaining in areas long after it has been released. The battlefield becomes not only a place of active danger, but of residual uncertainty. Ground that appears still can no longer be assumed to be safe. Time itself becomes a factor in its persistence, as effects do not disappear with the passing of moments. What defines these weapons most clearly is not only their physical impact, but their psychological effect. They alter the way space is perceived. Areas that were once defined by visible conditions are now influenced by invisible ones. Movement becomes cautious in a different sense, not only because of what is seen or heard, but because of what might remain unseen. The experience of this type of warfare is shaped heavily by anticipation. The uncertainty of when or where exposure might occur creates a constant undercurrent of attention. Even in moments when nothing is happening, there is awareness that conditions can change without warning. This creates a state that is difficult to fully describe in traditional terms. It is not constant action, but constant readiness, shaped by the possibility of sudden change. The lingering effects of gas exposure add another layer to this environment. Unlike injuries that are immediately visible, these effects can remain subtle or delayed. Recovery is not always clear or immediate, and the boundary between exposure and consequence is not always sharply defined. This contributes to a sense of unpredictability that extends beyond the moment of contact. Over time, the presence of gas becomes integrated into the overall structure of the battlefield. It is no longer treated as an isolated event, but as part of the broader system of warfare. Its use influences movement, strategy, and behavior, shaping decisions even when it is not actively present. The knowledge that it could appear changes how every other action is approached. In this way, gas warfare does not replace existing forms of conflict, but adds another layer to them. It exists alongside artillery, machine guns, and other established elements, expanding the range of conditions that must be considered. The battlefield becomes even more complex, not only in terms of physical danger, but in terms of environmental uncertainty. And within this expanded complexity, the experience remains defined by quiet awareness, not dramatic reaction, but sustained attention. A recognition that the air itself is no longer entirely predictable, and that even the simplest act of breathing has become part of the structure of survival. Injury in this environment does not follow a single pattern, nor does it arrive in ways that can be easily anticipated. It is not limited to moments of direct contact, but emerges from a wide range of conditions that define the battlefield. The body becomes exposed not only to immediate violence, but to fragments of a larger system. Impact, pressure, collapse, and exhaustion all contributing in different ways. What counts as an injury is often less about a single event and more about the accumulation of forces that surround it. Some injuries are immediate and unmistakable, the result of direct exposure to force. Others are less visible at first, developing gradually as conditions persist. There are those caused by impact, those shaped by environmental strain, and those that arise simply from being present within an area that is constantly under stress. The range is broad, but the outcome is always the same: a sudden change in the ability to continue as before. Once injury occurs, the process of response is shaped by distance and difficulty. Evacuation is not immediate, nor is it straightforward. The terrain itself becomes a barrier, shaped by mud, debris, and ongoing activity that makes movement slow and uncertain. Paths that might have been direct in another setting are now disrupted, forcing those responsible for evacuation to navigate conditions that are constantly changing. Time becomes a critical factor, but it is not always available in the way it is needed. Carrying someone from the front is not a simple act of removal. It requires coordination, effort, and awareness of the environment in which it takes place. The journey from a point of injury to a safer location is often long, marked by stops and adjustments dictated by circumstance. Every movement must account for the same conditions that caused the injury in the first place. In this sense, evacuation is not separate from a battlefield, but part of it, shaped by the same forces and limitations. Battlefield first aid exists within this structure as an immediate, necessary response. It is not a substitute for full treatment, but a temporary measure designed to stabilize conditions long enough for further movement. It is applied quickly, often under pressure, with limited resources and in environments that do not allow for ideal conditions. The focus is on maintaining continuity rather than achieving resolution. The goal is not recovery in the immediate sense, but survival through transition. The individuals providing this aid operate within constraints that define every action. Materials are limited, time is uncertain, and conditions are rarely stable. Despite this, procedures develop that allow for a level of consistency in response. These actions become routine through repetition, even when the circumstances remain unpredictable. The repetition itself becomes a form of structure within an otherwise unstable environment. Survival, in this context, is not determined solely by the severity of injury, but by a combination of timing, location, and circumstance. Two individuals with similar conditions may experience entirely different outcomes depending on when and where those conditions occur. This introduces an element of chance that is difficult to ignore. It is not randomness in the abstract sense, but variability shaped by the interaction of many overlapping factors. Distance from evacuation points, availability of assistance, and the intensity of surrounding activity all influence outcomes. In some cases, survival depends on being noticed quickly. In others, it depends on the temporary stability of the environment long enough for intervention to occur. These variables exist simultaneously, creating a system where outcomes are not fixed, but contingent. This reliance on circumstance does not reduce the importance of effort or procedure, but it does place them within a broader context. Actions taken in response to injury matter significantly, but they operate within boundaries that are not fully controllable. This creates a quiet tension between intention and outcome, where effort does not always align with result. Over time, this reality becomes part of how injury and survival are understood. It is not framed purely in terms of cause and effect, but in terms of probability and situation. The focus shifts from certainty to possibility, from guaranteed outcomes to potential ones. This does not diminish the value of intervention, but it changes how its role is perceived within the broader structure of the battlefield. There is a calmness in this understanding, not in the sense of emotional detachment, but in recognition of limitation. Conditions are acknowledged as they are, without expectation that they will conform to ideal outcomes. Within this framework, survival is neither fully predictable nor entirely arbitrary, but shaped by a combination of action and circumstance that cannot be fully separated. And so, within the ongoing structure of the war, injury becomes not only a moment of disruption, but part of a continuous process, one where outcomes are formed quietly, shaped by factors both visible and unseen, and carried forward by the same conditions that define everything else. The field hospital exists at the edge of the battlefield, both physically and structurally, positioned close enough to receive a constant flow of casualties, yet separated enough to function as a space of attempted control. It is not a place of calm in the traditional sense, but it is defined by a different kind of order, one shaped by necessity rather than comfort. Tents or temporary structures are arranged in rows, their purpose clear even before entering. Inside, the environment is marked by repetition, movement, assessment, treatment, and transition, all occurring continuously as new arrivals replace those who have been moved further back. Conditions within these spaces are functional rather than comfortable. Space is limited, and the number of individuals requiring attention often exceeds what the environment was designed to handle. Surfaces are practical, not restorative. Equipment is arranged for efficiency, not ease. Light filters through fabric or temporary roofing, creating a muted atmosphere where time feels less defined by natural cycles and more by operational demand. There is little distinction between day and night in terms of activity. The work continues regardless of external conditions. Surgical procedures are conducted with tools that are often basic by later standards, but adapted to the constraints of the environment. The focus is on immediacy and necessity rather than precision in ideal conditions. Procedures are performed quickly, with attention directed toward stabilization rather than long-term resolution. Every action is shaped by the understanding that time is limited and that conditions may change at any moment. The environment does not allow for prolonged deliberation, and decisions are made within narrow windows of opportunity. Despite the limitations, a system emerges that allows for continuity of care. Roles are defined, even if they are performed under pressure. Tasks are divided in ways that maintain flow through the space. Those who arrive are assessed, treated where possible, and moved onward as conditions allow. The process is repetitive, but is also structured, creating a framework within which work can continue despite uncertainty. Infection is one of the most persistent challenges within this environment. The conditions that define the battlefield do not end at the point of injury, and they continue to influence recovery. Even after initial treatment, complications can arise that alter the course of healing. These developments are not always immediate, and they require ongoing attention within an already strained system. The presence of infection introduces additional layers of complexity, extending the duration of care and increasing the demand placed on available resources. Recovery, when it occurs, is gradual and uncertain. It does not follow a predictable timeline, and outcomes vary widely depending on circumstances that extend beyond immediate treatment. Some individuals stabilize and move forward to other stages of care. Others require extended observation, while some do not recover as expected. The variability of these outcomes is an accepted part of the environment, integrated into the understanding of how the system functions. Within this structure, medical personnel operate under continuous pressure. Their work is defined not only by technical skill, but by sustained exposure to difficult conditions. The volume of cases, combined with the intensity of the environment, creates a form of ongoing strain that is difficult to separate from the work itself. Each case is addressed individually, but the accumulation of cases forms a broader experience that shapes perception over time. The emotional aspect of this work is present, though not always expressed directly. It is carried through repetition, through exposure, and through the constant requirement to continue functioning within conditions that do not pause. Over time, this leads to a form of exhaustion that is not sudden, but cumulative. It develops gradually, shaped by the continuous cycle of assessment and response. Despite this, the structure of the field hospital remains intact. It continues to operate because it must, maintaining a steady flow through systems that are constantly under pressure. There is little room for interruption, and the expectation of continuation remains constant regardless of circumstance. Even when conditions are strained, the process does not stop. From a clinical perspective, the field hospital represents a transitional space within the broader system of conflict. It exists between the immediate environment of injury and the longer-term structures of recovery or removal. Its function is defined by this position, and everything within it reflects that role. It does not resolve outcomes, but it facilitates movement toward them. And within this space, despite its limitations and pressures, a continuous effort persists, measured, structured, and sustained, not by ideal conditions, but by the necessity of maintaining care within an environment that allows for very little stability. There are parts of the war that cannot be measured in distance, time, or terrain. They do not appear in maps, and they are not marked by physical boundaries, yet they develop just as steadily as the trenches, the weapons, and the systems that surround them. These parts exist within the mind, shaped slowly by exposure to conditions that do not allow for rest or separation. At first, the mind attempts to process everything in the same way it always has, adapting to each new experience as though it were simply another variation of something already understood. But over time, the constant pressure begins to alter that process itself, changing not only how events are experienced, but how they are interpreted. One of the earliest signs of this change is not dramatic, but subtle. It appears in attention that no longer settles easily, in thoughts that do not remain in one place for long, and in a sense of alertness that does not diminish, even in moments of relative quiet. The mind remains engaged, even when the body is still, scanning, anticipating, holding on to patterns that may or may not repeat. This condition does not feel like fear in the immediate sense, but something more continuous, a state in which relaxation no longer fully occurs. As this continues, anxiety becomes less of a response and more of a background condition. It is not tied to a single event or moment, but distributed across time, present even when nothing is actively happening. The anticipation of sudden change becomes part of ordinary awareness. Each sound, each movement, each shift in the environment carries potential meaning, and the mind begins to treat all of them as requiring attention. Over time, this sustained state of alertness becomes exhausting, not because of intensity, but because of its lack of interruption. Alongside this, another response begins to develop. Where anxiety heightens sensitivity, numbness begins to reduce it. It is not an absence of feeling, but a gradual reduction in response to repeated exposure. Events that would once have been significant begin to register differently. The emotional reaction that might normally accompany them becomes less immediate, less pronounced. This is not a conscious decision, but a gradual adjustment, as though the mind is creating distance between itself and what it cannot continuously process at full intensity. This combination of heightened alertness and reduced emotional response creates a state that is difficult to define in simple terms. The mind is both more aware and less reactive, simultaneously absorbing more information while responding to it with less clarity. In some moments, this results in a sense of detachment, where events feel slightly removed, as though occurring at a distance that cannot be fully closed. Dissociation, in this context, does not appear as a single break, but as a gradual shift in perception. There are moments where surroundings feel less immediate, where actions feel partially automatic, and where the connection between thought and experience becomes less direct. Time itself can feel uneven, with certain periods standing out more clearly, while others pass without strong internal markers. This does not remove awareness, but alters its structure, making experience feel less continuous than before. These changes are not uniform across individuals, nor do they follow a predictable pattern. They develop differently depending on exposure, duration, and circumstance. However, within the environment of prolonged conflict, they become increasingly common, forming a shared but unspoken aspect of experience. There is little language available at the time to fully describe these states, and so they are often understood only in practical terms, through behavior, performance, and observed change rather than internal explanation. What becomes particularly significant is the moment at which the system itself can no longer fully account for these changes. The focus remains largely on physical conditions, on visible injury and immediate function, while the internal state of the mind is less clearly defined within existing frameworks. As a result, responses to these psychological effects are often limited in understanding, even when their presence is evident. The term shell shock emerges within this context as an attempt to describe observable patterns of breakdown, though its meaning is not yet fully developed or consistently applied. It reflects an awareness that something is occurring beyond physical injury, but does not yet provide a complete explanation of its nature. Those affected may exhibit signs of withdrawal, confusion, exhaustion, or inability to continue in their previous capacity. These responses are noted, but not always fully interpreted in psychological terms. The breaking point for individuals does not always occur in the same way. For some, it is a sudden inability to continue functioning within the demands placed upon them. For others, it is a gradual reduction in capacity, where tasks that were once manageable become increasingly difficult to sustain. In both cases, the result is a disruption in continuity, where the expected pattern of behavior can no longer be maintained in the same form. What is important to understand within this environment is that these responses are not separate from the conditions that produce them. They are not external reactions, but internal adaptations to sustained exposure. The mind, like the body, operates within limits, and when those limits are approached repeatedly without adequate recovery, the structure of response begins to change. This is not immediate collapse, but gradual transformation under pressure. Despite this, there is often little structured understanding of these processes at the time. Without clear frameworks to interpret them, responses tend to focus on immediate functionality rather than underlying cause. Individuals may be returned to duty, reassigned, or removed from active roles, depending on visible capacity. The internal state that led to these changes remains less clearly defined, often left unexamined within the broader system. Within the individual experience, however, these changes are deeply felt, even if they are not always clearly articulated. There is a sense of distance that develops over time, not necessarily from the environment itself, but from one's own reactions to it. Events continue to occur, but the internal response to them shifts in a way that alters their meaning. What once felt immediate becomes filtered through layers of adjustment that have formed gradually under sustained pressure. And so, within the ongoing structure of the war, the mind adapts in ways that are not always visible from the outside. It continues to function, but not always in the same manner as before. It carries the weight of repeated experience, not as a single burden, but as an accumulation of moments that reshape how everything is perceived. There is no clear point at which this begins or ends, only a gradual unfolding, where pressure becomes structure, and structure becomes the way experience is held. There is a different kind of silence that exists away from the front line, one that is not defined by the absence of artillery or movement, but by distance itself. It is the silence of separation, of lives continuing in parallel, but no longer in contact with the same immediacy. In this space, communication becomes fragile, reduced to written words that travel slowly through systems that do not guarantee their arrival. Letters become the only connection between two realities that are now increasingly difficult to reconcile. When a letter arrives, it does not feel like a simple message. It feels like a fragment of another world that has managed to pass through the layers of distance and disruption that separate the front from home. The envelope itself carries weight, not physically significant, but emotionally charged by what it represents. It is handled carefully, not because of fragility in the material sense, but because of what it contains. Before it is even opened, it already holds meaning. The process of receiving these letters is inconsistent. There is no predictable rhythm to their arrival. Days may pass without any communication, followed by sudden moments where multiple letters appear close together. This irregularity shapes expectation, creating a quiet tension between anticipation and uncertainty. Each delay carries no clear explanation, only the understanding that distance and circumstance have slowed the exchange beyond normal expectation. When a letter is finally opened, the content often reflects a world that feels both familiar and distant. The language is simple, shaped by daily life that continues in the absence of the recipient. There are mentions of ordinary events, weather, work, small changes in routine, family matters that would once have been shared in person without thought. These details create a sense of continuity, a reminder that life has not stopped, even if it has changed its shape. Yet, within these descriptions, there is often an underlying attempt to maintain steadiness. Words are chosen carefully, not always to conceal truth, but to soften its edges. Difficult realities may be reduced, concerns expressed indirectly, or optimism emphasized, even when circumstances may not fully support it. This is not deception in a deliberate sense, but a form of communication shaped by distance, by the desire to maintain connection without increasing worry. On the receiving end, these words are interpreted within a different context. The environment in which they are read is not neutral. It is shaped by conditions that contrast sharply with the world being described. This creates a separation between the content of the letter and the immediate reality in which it is received. The same words can carry both reassurance and dissonance at the same time. Hope becomes something that exists within this tension. It is supported by the act of communication itself, by the knowledge that connection still exists. At the same time, it is influenced by the awareness that the information received is incomplete, filtered through distance and circumstance. This creates a layered experience of reading, where meaning is not only in the words themselves, but in what is not fully said. Over time, the emotional response to these letters can begin to change. At first, they may bring a sense of grounding, a reminder of continuity beyond the immediate environment. But as conditions persist, the contrast between home and present reality can become more pronounced. The life described in letters continues in a way that feels increasingly separate, not in terms of significance, but in terms of experience. The gap between the two worlds becomes more noticeable with each exchange. This does not remove the importance of the connection, but it alters its emotional texture. The letters remain meaningful, but the way they are felt shifts subtly. There is awareness that both realities are true in their own contexts, yet they no longer overlap in the way they once did. The shared sense of time begins to fragment, with each side moving forward under very different conditions. There is also the matter of delay, which shapes interpretation in quiet but persistent ways. A letter that describes a recent event is already outdated by the time it is read. Information arrives not as current reflection, but as a record of a moment that has already passed. This creates a sense of temporal distance that adds to the emotional complexity of the exchange. What is being responded to is no longer exactly what is happening, but what has already occurred. Even so, the act of receiving and reading remains significant. It interrupts the monotony of the environment, offering a different kind of focus. For a short time, attention shifts away from the immediate conditions of the front and toward a different space entirely. This shift, however brief, creates contrast that is felt deeply, even if it is temporary. In this way, letters become more than communication. They become markers of connection across separation, fragile links between environments that no longer share the same rhythm. They carry not only information, but presence, the sense that someone elsewhere is still thinking, still writing, still maintaining a thread that has not yet been broken. And yet, beneath this connection, there remains a quiet awareness that the distance is not only physical, it is also experiential. The world described in letters continues in one direction, while the world in which they are read continues in another. Both are real, both are ongoing, but they no longer move in the same way. Within this quiet divergence, the letters remain, arriving irregularly, written carefully, read slowly, and held for longer than the words themselves might suggest. They exist as reminders of continuity, even as they highlight the growing space between what is remembered, what is imagined, and what is currently lived. As time continues to pass, the war no longer feels like a sequence of events with clear direction or resolution, but rather like a condition that has settled over everything. What once appeared to be a temporary disruption to normal life has extended far beyond initial expectation, stretching into years in a way that gradually reshapes how it is understood. The idea of a short conflict, something decisive and contained, fades slowly as reality demonstrates a different pattern, one defined not by movement toward conclusion, but by repetition without clear end. The landscape of the front reflects this change. Positions that were once newly established become deeply embedded into the terrain through constant reinforcement and repair. What was once improvised gradually becomes structured, not because conditions improve, but because they persist. The trenches, the supply routes, the defensive lines, all of them develop a sense of permanence that contrasts sharply with the original expectation that they would be temporary. Even the environment itself begins to show signs of prolonged strain, as constant activity alters the land in ways that do not easily reverse. Within this extended duration, optimism begins to change in nature. It does not disappear all at once, but becomes less immediate, less grounded in expectation of quick resolution. Early assumptions that the war would conclude swiftly are gradually replaced by more cautious thinking, then by uncertainty, and eventually by a form of resignation that does not fully articulate itself. Hope still exists, but it becomes less specific, less tied to clear timelines or outcomes. It shifts from anticipation of ending to endurance of continuation. The stalemate that defines much of this period is not static in the literal sense, but it lacks decisive movement. Advances are measured in small distances, often followed by similar or greater losses of ground. Gains, when they occur, are frequently temporary, absorbed back into the broader pattern of shifting positions. The result is a cycle that repeats with variation, but without resolution, creating a sense that progress and reversal are occurring simultaneously without altering the overall structure of the conflict. This repetition affects perception of time itself. Days begin to resemble one another more closely, not because nothing happens, but because the changes that do occur no longer provide clear markers of progression. Events are absorbed into a broader continuity that makes individual moments harder to distinguish. The sense of beginning and ending becomes less pronounced, replaced by an ongoing present that stretches without clear boundaries. At the same time, the systems supporting the war continue to expand and strain. Industrial output remains constant or increases, but the demand placed upon it grows in parallel. Factories operate continuously, supplying materials, equipment, and replacements in quantities that reflect the sustained nature of the conflict. This production is not intermittent, but continuous, feeding directly into the ongoing requirements of the front. The war becomes increasingly dependent on these systems, to the point where their operation is inseparable from its continuation. However, this sustained production also introduces its own form of exhaustion. Resources are consumed at a rate that challenges long-term balance, and the infrastructure supporting the war effort is placed under increasing pressure. The effort required to maintain continuity becomes significant in itself, extending beyond the battlefield into broader economic and social structures. In this way, exhaustion is not limited to individuals, but distributed across entire systems that must continue operating without pause. Within the lived experience of those at the front, this long duration produces a different kind of fatigue. It is not always acute, but cumulative. It builds slowly through repetition, through the absence of clear change, through the steady continuation of conditions that do not resolve themselves. The expectation of eventual conclusion remains present in some form, but it is no longer immediate or clearly defined. Instead, what develops is a sense of ongoing endurance. The war is no longer something that is moving toward a visible endpoint, but something that is being carried forward through continuous effort. Each moment contributes not to resolution, but to continuation. This creates a structure in which persistence becomes the primary form of engagement, replacing earlier ideas of decisive action or rapid outcome. As this continues, the emotional landscape adjusts accordingly. Reactions become more subdued, not because awareness decreases, but because repetition reduces the intensity of response. Events that might once have stood out now blend more easily into the broader flow of experience. This does not indicate absence of feeling, but shift in how feeling is expressed and sustained over time. There is also a quiet recognition that the conditions of the war are no longer exceptional in the way they once seemed. What was initially understood as extraordinary becomes normalized through duration. The extraordinary becomes routine, and the routine becomes the framework within which everything else is understood. This normalization does not reduce the difficulty of the experience, but it changes how it is perceived and processed. And so the war continues, not with dramatic transformation, but with steady repetition. Movements occur, but they do not accumulate into clear resolution. Systems operate, but they do not bring closure. Time passes, but it does not resolve the condition it contains. What remains is continuity itself, a structure defined not by beginning or end, but by sustained existence within an ongoing state that resists conclusion. By the end of the war, survival is less a matter of strength, skill, or preparation, and more a combination of conditions that rarely align for long enough to sustain a single individual. Looking back across the entire experience of the Western Front, it becomes clear that the factors influencing life and death are not isolated, but layered, each one reinforcing the others in ways that make endurance increasingly difficult. Survival, in this environment, is not defined by a single challenge, but by the continuous interaction of many. The environment itself is one of the first and most persistent obstacles. The landscape is not neutral ground, but a constantly shifting and deteriorating space shaped by weather, movement, and prolonged use. Mud, water, and structural decay are not temporary conditions, but ongoing features that define how every action must be taken. Movement is restricted, rest is compromised, and stability is never fully present. Even in moments of relative quiet, the environment continues to exert pressure, making simple existence more difficult than it would be in ordinary conditions. Layered onto this is the presence of weapons that have been developed and refined specifically for sustained conflict. Machine guns, artillery, barbed wire, and chemical agents each contribute in different ways to the difficulty of survival. Some restrict movement directly, others alter perception of space, and others extend danger beyond visible boundaries. What connects them is not only their individual effects, but their combined presence within the same environment. The battlefield is not shaped by one form of danger, but by many operating simultaneously, each reinforcing the limitations imposed by the others. Disease adds another layer that operates independently of direct conflict. The conditions of the environment create opportunities for infection, illness, and physical decline that are not always tied to immediate events. Exposure, limited sanitation, and constant strain contribute to a state in which the body is continuously under pressure from multiple directions. These conditions do not always present themselves dramatically, but they persist over time, influencing outcomes in ways that are often gradual rather than immediate. Alongside physical threats, there is the continuous presence of mental strain. The sustained exposure to danger, uncertainty, and repetition creates conditions in which the mind is required to adapt constantly. This adaptation is not uniform, nor is it always complete. Anxiety, fatigue, numbness, and dissociation develop as responses to ongoing pressure, each altering perception and reaction in different ways. Over time, these changes influence not only how events are experienced, but how decisions are made and how endurance is maintained. The mind, like the body, operates within limits that are tested repeatedly under these conditions. When all of these factors are considered together, survival appears less as a predictable outcome and more as a result of alignment between circumstances that are often unstable. The environment, the technology of war, the presence of disease, and the psychological demands of prolonged exposure do not act independently. Instead, they intersect continuously, creating conditions in which even small variations can determine vastly different outcomes. Two individuals may face similar situations, yet experience entirely different results depending on timing, location, and chance. This introduces a fundamental element that runs through the entire structure of the conflict: uncertainty, not in the sense of randomness alone, but in the interaction of many fixed systems producing variable outcomes. Survival is influenced by preparation and response, but is also shaped by factors that cannot always be controlled or predicted. In this context, chance becomes an unavoidable component of experience, not as the sole determining factor, but as one that exists alongside all others. Over time, this understanding reshapes how survival itself is perceived. It is no longer viewed as a simple reflection of ability or endurance, but as something that emerges from a complex and often unstable combination of conditions. The recognition of this does not diminish the effort involved in enduring the war, but it places that effort within a broader framework that includes elements beyond individual control. As the war draws to a close, what remains most evident is not a single defining cause of survival, but the accumulation of many overlapping pressures that shaped each moment. The environment pressed continuously from below. The weapons defined danger from above and across distance. Disease moved quietly through conditions of strain, and the mind adjusted under sustained exposure. Together, these elements formed a system in which stability was rare and continuation was uncertain. And so, in reflecting on why survival was so unlikely, what emerges is not a single answer, but a quiet recognition of complexity. A landscape shaped by many forces at once, where endurance was possible, but never guaranteed, and where simply continuing from one moment to the next was, in itself, the result of countless conditions aligning in ways that could not always be seen. In the end, survival was not only about what was faced, but about everything that surrounded it, visible and invisible, immediate and distant, constant and unpredictable.